Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight, I'm settling in with some Stardew Valley gameplay, paired with some truly moving stories of healing and growth. Tales from people who've navigated the painful end of relationships and emerged stronger on the other side. I've been exploring Reddit again, uncovering these journeys of heartbreak, self-discovery, and the surprising gifts that sometimes come wrapped in goodbye. And honestly, I think these redemptive stories might just comfort you, easing you into that reflective state of understanding and peaceful rest. So grab something warm, get comfy, and let's dive into these stories of closure and new beginnings together. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that sometimes the universe has a funny way of showing you exactly why a relationship needed to end. I spent 3 years building a life with someone who I thought was my future, only to realise 6 months after our breakup that I had been the one holding myself back the entire time. My ex-girlfriend Emma and I started dating when we were both 24, fresh out of college and trying to figure out adult life in a new city. She was working in marketing and I was starting my career in graphic design. Everything felt perfect at first, like we were two puzzle pieces that had finally found each other. We moved in together after 8 months, which everyone said was too fast, but we were convinced we knew better. The first year was honestly amazing. We had this little apartment with terrible heating and a kitchen so small we could barely both fit in it at the same time. But it felt like our own little world. We'd cook dinner together, watch movies until 2 in the morning, and talk about all our dreams for the future. Emma wanted to eventually start her own consulting business, and I was working on building my portfolio to land bigger freelance clients. We supported each other through stressful work weeks and celebrated every small victory like it was a major achievement. But somewhere around the 18-month mark, things started shifting in ways I didn't fully recognise at the time. Emma became increasingly focused on her career trajectory, which I completely understood and supported. The problem was that her version of support started to mean that my own goals needed to take a backseat. When I got offered a chance to work on a passion project that would have meant less income for a few months, but could have really elevated my portfolio, she sat me down and explained very logically why it was a bad financial decision. She made spreadsheets showing our monthly expenses and how my reduced income would impact our ability to save for the future she had planned for us. I convinced myself she was just being practical and looking out for our best interests. So I turned down the project and took on more stable but creatively unfulfilling work instead. This pattern repeated itself over the next year and a half. Opportunities would come up, chances to grow or try something new, and Emma would have very reasonable sounding explanations for why the timing wasn't right or why it was too risky. She never framed it as controlling. She always presented it as us being a team and making smart decisions together. But somehow every smart decision meant I was choosing security and her vision of our future over my own aspirations. My friends started commenting that I seemed different, less excited about my work, less like myself. I brushed off their concerns and told them that growing up meant making responsible choices. When I mentioned potentially taking some classes to expand my skill set, Emma worried about the cost and the time it would take away from us. When I talked about maybe trying to get a job at a creative agency instead of freelancing, she reminded me how much flexibility my current situation gave us, and how an office job would change our whole dynamic. Every conversation ended with me agreeing that she was probably right, that I was being impulsive or not thinking things through. The breakup itself was almost anticlimactic after 3 years of slowly dimming my own light. Emma sat me down one evening and told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking about our future. She said she loved me, but felt like we had grown into different people who wanted different things. The irony was that I had spent so long moulding myself into what I thought she needed that I barely recognised who I was supposed to be anymore. She had accepted a job opportunity in another state, one she had been interviewing for without telling me, and she thought it was the right time for both of us to figure out what we really wanted. I was devastated, not just because the relationship was ending, but because I suddenly realized I had no idea who I was outside of being Emma's boyfriend. I had spent 3 years making decisions based on what made sense for us, which really meant what made sense for her vision of our life. I had turned down projects, avoided risks, and slowly stopped pursuing the things that used to excite me. When she moved out 2 weeks later, I sat in our apartment, which was now just my apartment, surrounded by furniture we had picked out together and artwork on the walls that reflected her taste more than mine. The first month after the breakup was brutal in ways I hadn't expected. I kept waiting to feel the urge to reach out to her, to try to fix things or convince her we could make it work. But that urge never came. Instead, I felt this strange mixture of grief and relief that I couldn't quite untangle. I was mourning the relationship and the future I thought we were building, but I was also starting to feel this lightness, like I could finally breathe deeply for the first time in years. I started saying yes to things without overthinking every potential consequence. A former colleague reached out about collaborating on a project that was creatively challenging, but financially uncertain. My immediate instinct was to list all the reasons why it was impractical, but then I stopped myself and realized that voice in my head, sounding suspiciously like Emma's carefully constructed arguments. So I said yes. That project led to 3 more opportunities, and suddenly my portfolio was filling up with work I was actually proud of, instead of just work that paid the bills reliably. I signed up for an advanced design course I'd been interested in for over a year. I started going to networking events and meeting other creatives who were passionate and taking risks and building careers that looked nothing like the safe, predictable path I had been on. The most surprising part of the healing process was discovering how many small dreams I had set aside without even realizing it. I had wanted to try my hand at illustration, but convinced myself I wasn't good enough. I had thought about teaching workshops, but decided it was too much effort for too little return. I had ideas for passion projects that never made it past the thinking stage because they didn't fit into the 5-year plan Emma and I had created together. 6 months after the breakup, I ran into Emma at a coffee shop in our old neighbourhood. She was back in town visiting friends and looked exactly the same, put together and confident in that way she always was. We made small talk for a few minutes, catching up on surface-level life updates. She told me about her new job and how well things were going in her new city. I told her about the project I was working on and the direction my career was taking. Then she said something that caught me completely off guard. She told me I seemed different, lighter somehow, more like the person she had first met all those years ago. In that moment, I realized she was right. I was becoming that person again, the one who got excited about creative possibilities and wasn't afraid to take chances. The person I had been when we first started dating, before I started second-guessing every decision through the filter of what made sense for our relationship. We said goodbye cordially, and I walked away from that coffee shop with this profound sense of gratitude. Not gratitude that the relationship had ended, exactly, but gratitude that I had been given the chance to find myself again. Emma wasn't a villain in this story. She was just someone with a very clear vision of what life should look like, and I had been willing to shrink myself to fit into that vision. The breakup forced me to confront the reality that I had been complicit in my own diminishment, that I had handed over my decision-making power because it seemed easier than having difficult conversations about what I really wanted. A year after we split, my career had transformed in ways I never could have imagined while I was still trying to play it safe. I had built a client base doing work I loved. I was teaching monthly workshops to other designers, and I was genuinely excited about getting up and working each day. More importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment again, and to recognize the difference between someone supporting your dreams and someone managing them into something more palatable. Looking back now, I can see that the relationship with Emma taught me invaluable lessons about knowing myself and maintaining my own identity within a partnership. The heartbreak of that ending gave me the space to rebuild a life that actually reflected who I wanted to be, rather than who I thought I needed to be for someone else. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is let you go, so you can find your way back to yourself. That story reminds us that the end of a relationship, no matter how painful, can be the beginning of rediscovering the parts of yourself you didn't even realize you had set aside. Our next story comes from someone who learned that sometimes closure isn't about getting answers from your ex, but about finally understanding yourself well enough to write your own ending. I never thought I'd be the person who couldn't let go of a relationship that ended badly, but there I was, 2 years after my breakup with Marcus, still checking his social media profiles and wondering what I could have done differently. We had dated for 4 years, starting in our late 20s, and I genuinely believed we were heading toward marriage and all the traditional milestones that come with building a life together. Marcus was charming and ambitious, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately become the most interesting person there. He worked in finance and had this confidence that I found magnetic, especially since I had always been more reserved and cautious by nature. I was working as a librarian at the time, which Marcus used to joke about being the most perfectly fitting job for my personality. Looking back now, I can hear the subtle condescension in those jokes, but at the time I just laughed along and agreed that yes, I was quiet and bookish, and probably exactly what people pictured when they thought of librarians. The relationship ended abruptly and without much explanation. Marcus came home one evening, 3 weeks after we had been looking at apartments together to upgrade from my small one-bedroom, and told me he needed space to figure some things out. He moved his stuff out over the course of a weekend while I was visiting my parents, and when I returned, half of my life was just gone. He sent me a text saying he thought we wanted different things and that he needed to focus on his career. That was it. 4 years summarised in a text message that felt both painfully inadequate and somehow fitting for how little emotional effort he had been putting into us near the end. The first year after the breakup was a blur of trying to understand what had happened. I replayed every conversation, analysed every argument, and created elaborate theories about what I could have done differently. Maybe if I had been more social and enjoyed his networking events more. Maybe if I had been less sensitive when he made jokes at my expense in front of his colleagues. Maybe if I had pushed harder for us to do couples therapy when I first noticed the distance growing between us. I convinced myself that the relationship had failed because I hadn't been enough, hadn't tried hard enough, hadn't transformed myself into the partner he needed. My friends were incredibly patient during this phase, listening to me process the same thoughts over and over again. But eventually, even my most understanding friend Sarah sat me down and gently suggested that maybe I was so focused on what I had done wrong that I wasn't seeing what Marcus had done wrong. She reminded me of things I had somehow forgotten or minimised, how he would cancel plans with me at the last minute when something better came up with his work friends, how he had discouraged me from going back to school to get my master's degree because he thought it was a waste of money and wouldn't significantly increase my earning potential, how he had this way of making me feel like my interests and hobbies were quaint and small compared to his important career moves. But even with Sarah's perspective, I couldn't quite shake the feeling that I needed something more from Marcus, some explanation or conversation that would help me understand why 4 years of my life had ended so unceremoniously. I drafted countless emails and text messages that I never sent, each one asking for closure or understanding or just some acknowledgement that what we had mattered. The not sending them felt like a small victory each time, but the wanting to send them felt like a failure. Year 2 after the breakup was when things started shifting internally, though I didn't recognise it at the time. I had finally stopped checking Marcus's social media obsessively, partly because I had blocked him at Sarah's insistence, and partly because I was starting to get genuinely busy with my own life. I had enrolled in an online master's program in library science with a focus on digital archiving, something I had been interested in for years but had never pursued. The coursework was challenging and engaging in a way that reminded me how much I enjoyed learning and pushing myself intellectually. I also started attending a book club that met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed the social aspect of discussing literature with strangers who became friends. One of those new friends, Daniel, mentioned during a book club discussion about memoirs and personal narrative that he had found therapy helpful when he was processing his own difficult breakup years earlier. He wasn't pushy about it, just mentioned it casually as something that had helped him understand his patterns in relationships. I had resisted therapy throughout the breakup, telling myself I couldn't afford it and that I should be able to work through this on my own. But something about Daniel's casual mention made it seem less like admitting defeat and more like a practical tool I hadn't tried yet. I found a therapist who specialised in relationship issues and attachment styles, and our first few sessions were revelation after revelation. She helped me see patterns in my relationship with Marcus that I had been completely blind to while I was in it. How I had consistently made myself smaller to accommodate his need to be the centre of attention. How I had learned to suppress my own needs and desires to avoid conflict because Marcus had a way of making disagreements feel like personal attacks on him. How I had somehow convinced myself that being supportive meant never challenging him or expressing when something he did hurt me. But the real breakthrough came about 6 months into therapy, when my therapist asked me a question I hadn't considered before. She asked what I thought I had been getting from the relationship that made me willing to accept so little emotional reciprocity. I started to give my usual answer about love and partnership, but she pushed me to go deeper. What was I avoiding by staying in a relationship where I made myself so small? What did being with someone like Marcus allow me not to confront about myself? The answer, when I finally got honest enough to admit it, was that being with Marcus had allowed me to avoid taking risks and betting on myself. As long as I was focused on supporting his ambitions and managing his moods and making our relationship work despite its fundamental imbalances, I didn't have to face my own fears about pursuing bigger things. I had wanted to get my master's degree for years, but was scared I wouldn't be good enough. I had ideas for community programs at the library, but was afraid of putting myself out there and having them rejected. I had dreams about maybe writing something someday, but that felt too vulnerable and exposed. Being Marcus's supportive girlfriend had given me an identity and a purpose that didn't require me to risk failure. When he discouraged me from going back to school, part of me was almost relieved to have an external reason not to try. When he made jokes about my quiet personality, I could tell myself that was just who I was, rather than confronting the ways I had made myself quiet to take up less space in his life. The relationship, for all its problems, had been a convenient excuse to stay safe and small. This realization was both devastating and liberating. I'd spent 2 years looking for closure from Marcus, waiting for him to give me some explanation that would help me make sense of everything. But the closure I actually needed wasn't going to come from him. It was going to come from me finally understanding my own role in staying in a relationship that had stopped serving me long before it officially ended. 3 years after the breakup, I ran into Marcus at a professional conference I was presenting at, about digital archiving initiatives in public libraries. I had been asked to speak on a panel, something that would have terrified me during my relationship with him. I saw him in the audience before I went on stage, and my first instinct was panic. But then I took a breath and realised I wasn't the same person who had needed his approval or feared his judgment. I gave my presentation, answered questions confidently, and genuinely enjoyed the experience. Afterward, Marcus approached me and congratulated me on the presentation. He seemed genuinely impressed, which sparked a tiny flicker of the old need for his validation. But then he made a comment about how I had really come out of my shell, as if my growth and accomplishments were surprising given who I had been when we were together. And in that moment, I felt nothing but pity for him. He still saw me as the small, quiet person I had been when I was trying to fit into his life. He had no idea who I actually was because he had never really been interested in knowing. We made polite small talk for a few minutes, and then I excused myself to meet up with colleagues. As I walked away, I realised I had been carrying around this fantasy for years that Marcus would somehow see me thriving and realise what he had lost. But the actual experience of him seeing me succeed felt anticlimactic because I no longer needed him to recognise my worth. I had finally recognised it myself. That story shows us that the closure we desperately seek from others is often just a distraction from the harder work of understanding ourselves and why we accepted less than we deserved. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they thought was their soulmate was actually just their first lesson in learning what real partnership should look like. I met Jordan when I was 21, barely into my senior year of college, and everything about meeting them felt like destiny. We were both studying psychology, both worked at the campus coffee shop, and both had this intense way of analysing everything around us like the world was one giant case study. Jordan was non-binary and had this effortless, cool confidence that I found absolutely mesmerising. I had always been someone who overthought everything, who second-guessed myself constantly, and Jordan seemed to move through life with this certainty I desperately wanted for myself. Within 3 months, we were inseparable, and within 6 months we'd moved into a tiny apartment together off campus. Our friends called us the power couple, the ones who finished each other's sentences and seemed to operate on the same wavelength. We had running jokes that no one else understood, elaborate theories about human behaviour that we would discuss for hours, and plans to maybe open a practice together someday, where we could do couples therapy as a team. Looking back, I can see how much of our relationship was built on this intellectual compatibility and how little of it was built on actual emotional intimacy. We could analyse other people's relationships brilliantly, but we never turned that same analytical lens on ourselves. After graduation, we both got accepted into graduate programs in different cities. Jordan was headed to a prestigious program on the East Coast, while I was going to a solid but less competitive program in the Midwest. We decided to try long distance, convinced that our connection was strong enough to survive anything. For the first year, it almost worked. We would video chat every night, sometimes for hours, discussing our coursework and our future plans. Jordan was thriving in their program, getting opportunities to work with well-known researchers and building an impressive academic resume. I was doing fine in mine, getting good grades and learning a lot, but nothing particularly remarkable was happening. The cracks started showing in year 2 of graduate school, when Jordan began getting really involved with their cohort, attending conferences and workshops that I wasn't part of. They started referencing inside jokes with their new friends, people I had never met, and talking about experiences I couldn't relate to because my program was smaller and less intense. I started feeling left behind, like Jordan was evolving into this impressive academic while I was just trudging through my requirements. Jordan would say encouraging things about my work, but there was this undertone of condescension that I tried to ignore. They would ask about my research in this bright, interested voice that somehow made me feel like a child, showing their parent a finger painting. The really difficult part was that Jordan was never overtly cruel or dismissive. They were supportive in all the ways that looked right from the outside. They remembered important dates, sent care packages during finals week, and always asked thoughtful questions about my life. But there was this growing distance that I couldn't quite name or articulate. When I tried to bring it up, Jordan would get frustrated and say I was being insecure or that I was projecting my own anxieties about my program onto our relationship. And because Jordan had always been so good at psychological analysis, I believed them. I convinced myself that this was my issue, my insecurity, my problem to fix. 3 years into our relationship and halfway through our graduate programs, Jordan told me they needed to talk about something serious. They had been offered an incredible postdoctoral opportunity that would start right after graduation, one that would involve traveling internationally and working with renowned researchers. It was the kind of opportunity that could launch a career, and they were absolutely taking it. The problem was that it would mean at least 2 more years of long distance, possibly more, and they weren't sure our relationship could sustain that. They suggested we take a break, see other people, and reconnect down the line when our lives were more settled. I was absolutely shattered. In my mind, we had been building towards something, working through the temporary separation of graduate school so we could eventually build a life together. Jordan's willingness to pause our relationship for their career felt like a betrayal of everything I thought we were. I begged them to reconsider, suggested alternative arrangements, proposed that maybe I could transfer programs or find a way to come with them. Jordan said no to all of it, very calmly and rationally, explaining that we were both too young to be making major life decisions based on a relationship, that we needed to prioritize our individual growth. The breakup was clean and mature on the surface. We divided our shared belongings, mostly books and kitchen items we had accumulated over the years. Jordan helped me move my stuff into storage before I went home for the summer. We promised to stay friends and maybe check in down the line. But underneath that civilized exterior, I was completely falling apart. I spent that entire summer in a fog of grief and confusion, unable to understand how someone who loved me could so easily choose their career over us. Graduate school continued without Jordan, and it was both harder and easier than I expected. Harder because everything reminded me of them, every psychological theory we had discussed together, every coffee shop that looked like the one where we met. Easier because without the constant comparison to Jordan's impressive achievements, I started actually enjoying my own work. I got involved in a research project with one of my professors that was fascinating and challenging in ways I hadn't expected. I started building friendships with people in my program instead of just video chatting with Jordan every night. Slowly, without even realizing it, I was becoming my own person instead of half of a power couple. About a year after the breakup, I was at a conference presenting some of my research when I struck up a conversation with another graduate student named Maya. She was funny and warm and asked genuine questions about my work that weren't performative or condescending. We exchanged contact information and started messaging occasionally about our research and graduate school struggles. Maya became a friend first, someone I could talk to about the isolation of graduate work and the imposter syndrome that seemed to plague everyone in our field. She never made me feel like my achievements were less impressive than hers, even though she was also doing her remarkable work. 6 months into our friendship, Maya invited me to visit her city for a weekend. Nothing romantic, just 2 friends hanging out and exploring the local museums and coffee shops. But somewhere during that weekend, walking through an art gallery and discussing the psychology of aesthetic appreciation, I realized I felt more seen and understood by Maya in a few months than I had felt by Jordan in 3 years. Maya asked questions because she wanted to know what I thought, not so she could analyze and correct my thinking. She celebrated my successes without that subtle undercurrent of competition. She was comfortable with silence in a way Jordan never had been, not needing to fill every moment with intellectual discourse. We started dating slowly and carefully, both aware that long distance had complications, but willing to try. What struck me most about being with Maya was how easy it felt. Not easy like effortless, but easy like natural. We had disagreements and worked through them without someone playing therapist and diagnosing the other's issues. We supported each other's careers without keeping score of whose opportunities were more impressive. We could be smart together without it being a performance or a competition. 2 years after my breakup with Jordan, I defended my dissertation successfully. Maya flew in to be there, and so did several friends from my program who had become genuinely important people in my life. After the defense, my advisor pulled me aside and told me she'd been worried about me when I first started the program, that I had seemed uncertain and afraid to take up space. But she said watching me grow into a confident researcher who trusted their own insights had been one of the highlights of her career as a mentor. That comment stayed with me because I realised that the person I had been with Jordan, the one who constantly felt less than and inadequate, hadn't been the real me. That had been who I became when I was trying to be worthy of someone who saw love as a meeting of intellectual equals, where someone always had to be slightly more equal. Maya had helped me see that real partnership wasn't about matching someone's achievements or proving your worth through constant analysis. It was about being with someone who liked who you actually were, not who you might become if you worked hard enough. I heard through mutual friends that Jordan's postdoctoral work was going incredibly well, that they were publishing and presenting and building exactly the career they had wanted. I felt happy for them in an abstract way, the same way you might feel happy hearing that an old classmate was doing well. But I didn't feel that old longing for what we had or regret about what could have been. Jordan had taught me what I didn't want in a relationship, and that turned out to be just as valuable as if they had taught me what I did want. The closure I needed from that relationship didn't come from any final conversation or explanation from Jordan. It came from building a life I was proud of and finding a relationship where I didn't have to constantly prove I deserved to be there. It came from realizing that being someone's intellectual equal was meaningless if you weren't also their emotional equal, if you couldn't be vulnerable and messy and uncertain without it being treated as a problem to solve. That story reminds us that sometimes the relationship we thought was everything was actually just preparing us to recognize the real thing when it finally showed up. Our next story comes from someone who learned that walking away from a relationship doesn't make you a quitter. Sometimes it makes you the bravest version of yourself you've ever been. I had been with Tyler for 7 years when I finally ended things, and those 7 years felt like both a lifetime and somehow not nearly long enough to justify the depth of grief I experienced afterward. We started dating when I was 23, fresh out of college and working my first real job at a non-profit that paid terribly but felt meaningful. Tyler was a bartender with dreams of opening his own restaurant someday, and he had this charisma that made everyone around him feel like they were part of something exciting. Our early dates were adventures, spontaneous road trips to neighbouring states, late-night conversations that stretched until sunrise, the kind of whirlwind romance that makes you feel alive in ways you didn't know were possible. But somewhere between year 2 and year 3, the adventure started feeling less like excitement and more like instability. Tyler's restaurant dreams never quite materialised into concrete plans. He would get intensely passionate about an idea for a few weeks, research locations and menu concepts, and then something would derail it. The investors would fall through, or the location would get rented to someone else, or he would decide the concept wasn't quite right after all. Each failure would send him into a depression that lasted weeks, where I would become his sole source of emotional support, encouraging him and believing in him even as I watched the same pattern repeat over and over. My job at the non-profit was demanding and emotionally draining, working with families in crisis and never having enough resources to truly help everyone who needed it. I would come home exhausted and depleted, and Tyler would be in the middle of his own crisis about a failed business plan or a conflict with his boss at the bar. I learned to put my own struggles aside and focus on supporting him, convinced that's what partners did for each other. But I started noticing that when I did try to talk about my difficult days, Tyler would listen for a few minutes before somehow redirecting the conversation back to his own problems. It wasn't malicious or intentional. He was just so consumed by his own disappointments that there wasn't much room left for mine. Year 4 brought a brief period of hope when Tyler finally secured a small business loan and found a location for his restaurant. I watched him pour everything into that project, working 18-hour days between his bartending shifts and the restaurant build-out. I supported him in every way I could, helping with administrative tasks, designing his menu layouts because I had some graphic design skills, and covering our rent for 3 months when money got tight. The restaurant opened to decent reviews and steady business for about 6 months. Then Tyler's business partner, someone he had known since high school, started skimming money from the register. The discovery of the theft destroyed Tyler emotionally and financially. The partnership dissolved, the restaurant closed, and Tyler spent the next year paying off debts and sinking into a depression that no amount of my support seemed to touch. I suggested therapy multiple times, offered to go to couples counselling, researched sliding scale mental health resources. Tyler would agree it was a good idea and then never actually make an appointment. He would say he was handling it, that he just needed time, that talking to a stranger wouldn't help because they wouldn't understand his specific situation. Meanwhile, I was slowly disappearing into the role of caretaker, managing both of our lives because Tyler was too depressed to handle basic tasks. I paid all our bills, did all the housework, and provided constant emotional support while my own mental health deteriorated under the weight of trying to keep us both afloat. My friends started expressing concern, gently at first and then more directly. They pointed out that I never seemed happy anymore, that I had stopped doing things I used to love, that every conversation I had seemed to revolve around Tyler's latest crisis. I defended him and our relationship, insisting that he would get through this rough patch and things would go back to how they used to be. But deep down, I was starting to realise that there had never really been a time when the relationship wasn't in crisis mode. Even in the good early years, there had always been some drama or obstacle that required my emotional labour to navigate. Year 6 was when I started having panic attacks, waking up in the middle of the night with my heart racing and this overwhelming sense that I was drowning. My doctor suggested that stress and burnout were likely contributors and recommended I consider therapy and possibly medication. I started seeing a therapist who specialised in anxiety and depression, and our sessions gradually shifted from managing my symptoms to examining the root causes of my stress. She never told me to leave Tyler, but she asked questions that forced me to confront realities I had been avoiding. What did I get from this relationship? When was the last time I felt genuinely supported by Tyler? What would my life look like if I wasn't responsible for managing someone else's emotional well-being? The answers to those questions were devastating to face. I realised I had spent 7 years believing that love meant sacrificing yourself completely for another person, that being a good partner meant absorbing all of someone else's pain and disappointment. I had confused unconditional love with unconditional tolerance of treatment that was slowly destroying me. Tyler wasn't abusive in any obvious way. He never yelled or called me names, or tried to control who I spent time with. But there was a kind of passive consumption happening, where my entire life had become about keeping him afloat while my own needs went completely unmet. The decision to leave didn't come in one dramatic moment. It came gradually over several months of therapy and honest self-reflection. I started setting small boundaries, saying no to things I didn't have the energy for, asking Tyler to handle tasks he had been relying on me to manage. He responded to these boundaries with confusion and hurt, genuinely not understanding why I was suddenly being difficult. To him, nothing had changed. We had always operated this way, with me carrying the bulk of the emotional and practical labour while he struggled with his demons. My sudden unwillingness to continue that pattern felt like a betrayal to him. I told Tyler I was leaving on a Tuesday evening in March, 7 years and 4 months after our first date. I had planned what I wanted to say, rehearsed it with my therapist, and prepared myself for his reaction. He cried and begged me to reconsider, promised he would change and go to therapy and be better. But I had heard those promises before, and I finally understood that change only happens when someone is ready to do the hard work themselves, not when someone else threatens to leave if they don't. I moved out that weekend into a small studio apartment that was just mine, furnished with a mattress on the floor and a folding chair until I could afford more. The first 3 months after the breakup were simultaneously the hardest and most liberating time of my life. I grieved the loss of 7 years and the future I had imagined we would build once Tyler finally got stable. But I also experienced this strange lightness, waking up in my tiny apartment and realizing I didn't have to manage anyone's emotions but my own. I started painting again, something I had loved in college but abandoned because there was never time or energy for hobbies. I reconnected with friends I had drifted away from during the years of crisis management. I took a weekend trip by myself to the beach and spent 2 days just reading and walking and existing without having to worry about someone else's needs. 6 months after the breakup, I ran into one of Tyler's friends at a coffee shop. He told me Tyler was doing better, that he had finally started going to therapy and was working on himself. Part of me felt vindicated that he could apparently prioritize therapy once I was gone, proving that it had always been possible if he had wanted it badly enough. But mostly I just felt sad that it had taken losing me for him to start doing the work. I hoped he would figure things out and build a healthier life, but I also knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't have stayed to watch that process. Some people need to hit bottom before they're ready to climb back up, and I had learned the hard way that you can't save someone by letting them drag you down with them. A year after leaving, I was offered a promotion at work that would have been impossible when I was with Tyler because it required travel and long hours. I accepted it and discovered I was actually really good at my job when I had the energy to fully commit to it. I started dating again, casually at first, and was amazed by how different it felt to be with people who asked about my day and actually listened to the answer. I went on a date with someone who suggested we cut the evening short because they could tell I was tired from work, prioritizing my well-being over their own desire to spend more time together. That simple act of consideration made me cry in my car afterward, realizing how long it had been since anyone had put my needs first. The closure I needed from my relationship with Tyler didn't come from him. It came from building a life where I remembered who I was before I became someone's emotional support system. It came from realizing that leaving wasn't giving up on love. It was finally loving myself enough to demand reciprocity and care. The 7 years I spent with Tyler taught me exactly what I wouldn't accept in future relationships, and that knowledge turned out to be worth every painful moment of walking away. That story shows us that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to drown alongside someone who won't reach for the lifeline you keep throwing them. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the end of their longest relationship was actually the beginning of understanding what they had been running from all along. I was 32 when Vanessa and I broke up after 9 years together, and the thing that surprised me most wasn't the grief or the loneliness, but the overwhelming sense of relief that I spent months trying to suppress because it felt like a betrayal of everything we had built. We met in our early 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party, both of us nursing hangovers from the night before, and making cynical jokes about how we were getting too old for this kind of scene. She was studying architecture and I was working in software development, and we bonded over being the practical, responsible ones in our friend groups who somehow always ended up taking care of everyone else. Our relationship developed steadily and sensibly, exactly the way I thought adult relationships were supposed to work. We moved in together after a year, adopted a cat after 2 years, and started talking about marriage around year 4. Vanessa was everything I thought I should want in a partner. She was intelligent and ambitious, had a good relationship with her family, was financially responsible, and shared my taste in music and movies. On paper, we were perfect for each other. Our friends treated us like relationship role models, the stable couple who never had dramatic fights or chaotic breakups and reconciliations. We hosted dinner parties and took tasteful vacation photos and discussed our 5-year plans like we were business partners presenting to investors. But there was something missing that I couldn't quite name or articulate for years. The sex was infrequent and felt more like a box we were checking than something either of us genuinely desired. Our conversations were pleasant, but rarely went deeper than discussing work stress or planning our next home improvement project. We functioned well as roommates and life partners, but there was this emotional intimacy that I kept waiting to develop and never quite did. I told myself that passion fades in long-term relationships, that what we had was mature love, that expecting butterflies and intense connection after years together was unrealistic. Year 7 was when I started having this recurring dream where I was running through an airport trying to catch a flight, but every time I got close to the gate, it would move to a different terminal. I would wake up anxious and unsettled, and Vanessa would ask if I was okay, and I would say yes because I didn't know how to explain that the dream felt like a metaphor for something I couldn't quite grasp. I started going to therapy ostensibly for work stress, but my therapist kept gently steering our conversations toward my relationship and my overall life satisfaction. She asked me what I was passionate about, what made me feel alive, and I realised with growing horror that I couldn't answer those questions. The truth was that I had built my entire adult life around being stable and responsible and doing the right things, and somewhere in that process, I had completely lost touch with what I actually wanted. I had chosen software development because it paid well, not because I loved it. I had moved to the city where Vanessa got her dream job, even though I had secretly hoped we might end up somewhere with mountains and hiking trails. I had agreed to skip the adventurous honeymoon she thought was impractical in favour of investing that money in our retirement accounts. Every decision had been reasonable and mature, and every decision had moved me further away from any sense of myself as a person, with desires that might be impractical or inconvenient. Vanessa and I started having more frequent disagreements in year 8, mostly about small logistical things that somehow felt loaded with larger meaning. She wanted to buy a house in the suburbs near her parents, and I kept finding reasons to delay that decision. She was ready to start trying for kids, and I kept saying I wanted to wait until my career was more stable. These disagreements never escalated into big fights because neither of us were fighters, but they created this low-level tension that sat between us like a third presence in our apartment. The real crisis came when I was offered a job opportunity that would have required relocating to Colorado. It was a position doing work I had always been interested in, but never pursued, with a company doing meaningful projects in environmental technology. The salary was comparable to what I was making, and the location was in a mountain town I had visited once years ago and never stopped thinking about. When I mentioned it to Vanessa, she was confused about why I was even considering it. Her career was established here, her family was here, our entire life was here. Moving would mean starting over. And for what? A lateral career move to a place where we didn't know anyone? I withdrew my application without really deciding to, just stopped responding to the recruiter's emails until the opportunity passed. But something had shifted in me during those few days of imagining what that other life might look like. I started noticing all the ways I had been making myself smaller and quieter to fit into the life Vanessa and I had built. I started resenting her for things that weren't really her fault, like the fact that we spent every holiday with her family because mine lived far away, and she found travel stressful, or the way our apartment was decorated entirely in her aesthetic because I had claimed not to care about design, when really I just didn't have the energy to argue for what I wanted. My therapist asked me point blank during one session if I was happy, and I burst into tears because I couldn't remember the last time I had asked myself that question. I told her about the job I hadn't taken, about the dreams where I was always running towards something I could never reach, about the growing certainty that I had built a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow from the inside. She asked what I thought would happen if I told Vanessa the truth about how I was feeling, and I realised I was terrified because the truth would destroy everything we had spent 9 years building. I finally worked up the courage to have that conversation on a Saturday morning in October. I told Vanessa that I loved her but wasn't in love with her, that I had been going through the motions of our relationship for longer than I wanted to admit, that I didn't want the life we had been planning together. She was devastated and angry, demanding to know if there was someone else, or how long I had been feeling this way, or why I had wasted 9 years of her life if I wasn't sure about us. I couldn't give her satisfying answers because I didn't fully understand it myself. There wasn't someone else. I had been feeling this way gradually, without consciously acknowledging it. And I hadn't intentionally wasted anyone's time. I had genuinely been trying to make it work until I finally couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The breakup was messy and painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. We had to untangle 9 years of shared finances and belongings and friendships. Vanessa moved in with her sister while I stayed in our apartment, surrounded by furniture we had chosen together and photos from trips that now felt like they had happened to different people. I felt guilty and relieved and heartbroken all at once, grieving the loss of my partner while simultaneously feeling like I could finally breathe fully for the first time in years. The first few months after the breakup, I did things that probably looked like a cliché midlife crisis. From the outside, I quit my job and took a temporary position that allowed me to work remotely. I sublet our apartment and spent 3 months hiking through national parks, sleeping in my car in cheap motels, and finally having space to think without the constant noise of the life I had been living. I started journaling for the first time since college, trying to untangle who I actually was from who I had been performing as for the past decade. What I discovered during those months was that I had been running from myself for years, terrified that if I stopped being the responsible, stable, practical version of myself, there would be nothing underneath. I had built my identity around being the person others could depend on, the one who made reasonable choices and never caused problems. Being with Vanessa had felt safe because she wanted the same stable, predictable life I thought I was supposed to want. Breaking up with her meant confronting the reality that I had been using our relationship as another way to avoid asking difficult questions about what I actually wanted from life. I eventually ended up taking a job in Oregon, not the original Colorado opportunity, but something similar, working for a company focused on sustainable technology. I moved to a small town near the coast where I could hike on weekends and hear the ocean from my apartment. I started dating again eventually, but this time I was honest with myself and potential partners about what I was looking for. I learned to recognize the difference between someone who felt comfortable and someone who felt right, between a relationship that looked good on paper and one that made me want to show up as my full self. About 2 years after the breakup, I heard through mutual friends that Vanessa had gotten engaged to someone she had met at work. I felt genuinely happy for her, hoping she had found with this new person the connection we had never quite achieved. I also felt grateful that I had been brave enough to end things when I did, before we had gotten married or had kids or become even more entangled in a life that worked logistically but failed emotionally. The closure I needed didn't come from any final conversation with Vanessa or from achieving some specific goal that proved I had made the right choice. It came from slowly building a life that felt authentic, from learning to trust my own desires, even when they didn't make practical sense, from understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is admit that you're not the right person for them, The 9 years I spent with Vanessa weren't wasted time. They were the necessary journey to understanding that a good relationship on paper means nothing if it costs you the relationship with yourself. That story teaches us that sometimes we stay in relationships, not because they're right, but because leaving would mean confronting truths about ourselves we've been carefully avoiding for years. Our next story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the relationship you need to heal from isn't just the one that ended, but all the ones that came before it that taught you to accept less than you deserved. I was 29 when I finally left Adrian after 5 years together, and what shocked me most wasn't how hard the breakup was, but how quickly I recognised the patterns I had been repeating since my very first relationship at 16. Adrian was my third long-term relationship, and each one had followed an eerily similar trajectory. I would meet someone charismatic and confident, someone who seemed to have their life together in ways I didn't. I would be drawn to their certainty and direction, grateful that someone like that wanted to be with someone like me. And then slowly, over months or years, I would contort myself into increasingly smaller shapes, trying to be whatever they needed me to be. With Adrian, the relationship started like all the others had, with intensity and grand gestures and promises about our future together. We met at a friend's wedding where I was a bridesmaid, and Adrian was crashing the reception with some mutual acquaintances. They were charming and funny, telling elaborate stories that had everyone at our table laughing, and when they asked for my number at the end of the night, I felt chosen in a way that made me giddy. Our first few months were a whirlwind of concerts and road trips and late-night conversations where Adrian would tell me about their difficult childhood and their dreams of becoming a filmmaker. I loved feeling like I was the person they trusted with their vulnerable side, the one who got to see behind the charismatic exterior. But around month 6, small things started shifting. Adrian would make plans with me and then cancel last minute because they had to work on a film project or needed to network at some industry event. When I expressed disappointment, they would get defensive and remind me that their career had to be the priority if they were ever going to make it in such a competitive field. I learned to swallow my disappointment and be supportive instead, convincing myself that good partners sacrificed and understood when their person was pursuing their dreams. Adrian would go weeks being distant and preoccupied, and then suddenly shower me with attention and affection, and I would be so grateful for those good moments that I would forget how bad the neglect felt. Year 2 brought more frequent arguments that all seemed to follow the same script. I would try to express a need or boundary. Adrian would make me feel like I was being unreasonable or too demanding, and I would end up apologising for having needs in the first place. When I mentioned wanting to spend more quality time together, Adrian said I was being clingy and needed to have my own life. When I pulled back and made plans with friends, Adrian accused me of not being invested in our relationship. I was constantly trying to calibrate my behaviour to hit some impossible target that seemed to move every time I got close to it. My friends started expressing concern, but I had become skilled at defending Adrian and our relationship. I would explain the context they were missing, justify the behaviour that seemed problematic from the outside, and insist that every couple had issues. My best friend Rachel finally told me bluntly that she was worried about me, that I seemed like a dimmer version of myself, that she missed the person I used to be before I started trying so hard to be what Adrian needed. I was angry with her for weeks after that conversation, offended that she couldn't see how much Adrian and I loved each other. But her words planted a seed that I couldn't quite ignore. Year 3 was when I started therapy, initially to deal with what I thought was just general anxiety and depression. My therapist asked about my relationship early on, and I gave her the sanitized version where everything was basically fine with normal couple struggles. But over weeks and months, the truth started emerging in small details. The way Adrian would give me the silent treatment for days after disagreements, how I had stopped sharing my own creative work because Adrian's criticism, disguised as feedback, always left me feeling inadequate. The fact that I couldn't remember the last time Adrian had asked me how I was doing and genuinely listened to the answer. My therapist introduced me to the concept of attachment styles and relationship patterns, and it was like someone had handed me a map to my entire romantic history. I had an anxious attachment style that had been formed by inconsistent parenting and reinforced by every relationship I had chosen since. I was drawn to avoidant partners who would give me just enough attention to keep me hooked, but never enough to feel secure. I would work harder and harder to earn their love and validation, and they would pull further away, and the cycle would continue until either they left or I collapsed from exhaustion. Recognizing the pattern didn't immediately give me the strength to leave. I spent another year trying to apply what I was learning in therapy to my relationship with Adrian, attempting to communicate differently and set healthier boundaries. But the fundamental dynamic never changed. Adrian didn't want a partner who had boundaries and needs. They wanted someone who would orbit around their life and be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they offered. Every attempt I made to advocate for myself was met with defensiveness or dismissiveness or promises to change that never materialized into actual changed behavior. The final catalyst came when I was offered a job opportunity in another city, a really good position doing work I cared about with a significant salary increase. When I told Adrian, expecting we would discuss it and figure out what it meant for us, they barely looked up from their phone. They said something vague about how long distance never works and that I should do what I wanted. No discussion about possibly coming with me, no grief about the relationship potentially ending, just complete indifference. In that moment, I realized with devastating clarity that Adrian had 1 foot out the door of our relationship already, had probably had 1 foot out the entire 5 years, and I had been working so hard to make them stay that I had never noticed they weren't actually present anyway. I took the job and ended the relationship, and Adrian's reaction confirmed everything I had finally allowed myself to see. They were relieved, said they had been feeling like things weren't working but hadn't known how to end it, and helped me pack my stuff with a cheerfulness that was almost cruel in its lightness. They wished me well, gave me a casual hug, and that was it. 5 years summarised in a 30-minute conversation, and a hug that felt like something you would give an acquaintance. The move to the new city and the months that followed were transformative in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without Adrian's presence and the constant anxiety of trying to be enough for someone who didn't really want me, I had space to actually process not just this breakup, but all the relationships that had come before it. I dove deep into therapy, reading everything I could about attachment theory and relationship patterns and why we're drawn to people who recreate our earliest wounds. I joined a support group for people working through codependency issues, and hearing other people's stories helped me feel less alone in my patterns. But the real work was learning to build a relationship with myself, to notice my own needs and desires without immediately dismissing them as too much or not important. I started small, letting myself sleep in on weekends instead of being productive every moment, ordering food I actually wanted instead of whatever seemed most reasonable, taking myself on solo trips to places I was curious about without needing someone else to validate that it was a good idea. I practiced sitting with uncomfortable emotions instead of immediately trying to fix them or make them go away. I learned that I could be lonely without being alone, and alone without being lonely. About 8 months after the breakup, I went on a date with someone I met through work. They were kind and interesting, and midway through dinner, they asked me a question about my family that I deflected with a joke. They paused and said gently that they noticed I did that, redirected away from anything personal, and they were genuinely interested in knowing me if I was willing to share. Something about that moment, the gentleness and genuine interest without pressure, made me realise how far I had come. The old me would have immediately shared everything, desperate to be known and chosen. But I had learned that real intimacy is built slowly, and with people who have earned access to your vulnerable parts. I ended up dating that person for several months, and while it ultimately didn't work out, it was the healthiest relationship dynamic I had ever experienced. We communicated openly about our needs, respected each other's boundaries, and when we realised we wanted different things long term, we ended it with mutual respect and care. The relationship not working out didn't feel like a failure or a reflection of my inadequacy. It just felt like two people who weren't quite right for each other, and that was okay. 2 years after leaving Adrian, I was in a coffee shop working when I overheard someone at the next table talking about their partner in a way that made my chest tight with recognition. They were describing the same patterns I had lived, the same confusion about why they kept trying so hard for someone who seemed barely interested. I wanted to lean over and tell them what I had learned, that some people will never meet you halfway, no matter how far you extend yourself, that you can't love someone into loving you back the way you need. But I knew that was a lesson everyone has to learn in their own time. The closure I got from my relationship with Adrian, and really from all my relationships before that, didn't come from any conversation or explanation. It came from finally understanding that I had been seeking external validation to fill an internal void, trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it, because some part of me believed that's what I deserved. The work of healing wasn't about finding a better partner. It was about becoming the kind of person who wouldn't accept breadcrumbs and call it a feast, who valued their own presence enough to only offer it to people who cherished it. That story shows us that sometimes you have to lose yourself completely in the wrong relationships before you can find yourself in the right one, which turns out to be the relationship with yourself all along. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the person they spent 6 years trying to fix was never actually broken, just fundamentally incompatible with the life they wanted to build. I was 25 when I met Dominic at a music festival, and everything about him seemed like the opposite of the safe, predictable life I had been living. He was a musician who played in 3 different bands, had tattoos covering both arms, and lived in a converted van he had renovated himself. I was working a corporate job I hated, living in a beige apartment that looked like a furniture catalogue, and spending my weekends meal prepping and doing laundry. Meeting Dominic felt like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't even realise was suffocating me. Our relationship in the beginning was intoxicating. Dominic introduced me to underground music venues and late-night jam sessions, and a whole community of artists and musicians who seemed to live by completely different rules than the ones I had been following my entire life. He was spontaneous in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. We would drive 4 hours on a weeknight to see a band he loved, sleeping in his van in a parking lot and showing up to work exhausted but exhilarated. He taught me to stop planning everything down to the minute, to embrace uncertainty and possibility. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was actually living instead of just existing. But there were red flags I chose to interpret as charming quirks. Dominic was chronically unreliable, showing up hours late to plans we had made, or sometimes not showing up at all because he had gotten caught up in a creative project or jam session with friends. He was always broke despite playing multiple gigs because he spent money the moment he had it, buying expensive equipment or taking his bandmates out for drinks. He borrowed money from me regularly with sincere promises to pay it back, but those promises never materialized into actual repayment. I told myself that creative people operated differently, that his artistic temperament was part of what made him special, that my corporate job meant I could afford to support someone who was pursuing their passion. Around year 2, I started trying to help Dominic create more stability in his life. I helped him create a budget and a system for tracking his income and expenses. I connected him with a friend who did booking for venues, hoping to get him more consistent gigs. I suggested he consider teaching music lessons to supplement his performance income. even offering to help him set up a website and advertise his services. Dominic would enthusiastically agree to all of these plans, genuinely grateful for my help and support, but then nothing would actually change. The budget would be abandoned after a week. The venue connections would go nowhere because he would forget to follow up. The music lesson idea would never get past the talking stage. I interpreted his inability to follow through as a confidence issue, or maybe undiagnosed ADHD, and I became even more determined to help him succeed. I started managing aspects of his life that he seemed incapable of handling himself. I would book his gigs, handle his scheduling, and even help him write set lists for performances. I paid for recording time at a studio so he could finally make a demo, convinced that once he had professional recordings, everything would fall into place. When the recordings were finished, Dominic was thrilled for about a week, and then never sent them to anyone or used them to book better shows. My friends and family were increasingly concerned about our relationship. My sister pointed out that I had essentially taken on a dependent rather than a partner, that I was pouring time and money and energy into someone who wasn't meeting me halfway. My best friend asked me point blank what I was getting from the relationship, besides the satisfaction of feeling needed. I got defensive and angry, insisting they didn't understand Dominic's creative process, that artists needed support and patience, that I was investing in our future together. Year 4 was when the resentment started building in ways I couldn't ignore. I was working 50-hour weeks at my corporate job to support both of us while Dominic played music and talked about his dreams, but never took concrete steps to make them reality. I was exhausted all the time, burning out from trying to manage 2 lives while Dominic remained perpetually in the moment, unburdened by practical concerns. When I would try to talk to him about feeling overwhelmed or needing more support, he would get hurt and defensive, saying I was trying to change him or that I didn't really understand his artistic soul. The breaking point came when I was offered a promotion that would require relocating to another city. It was a significant step up in my career, better pay and more responsibility, exactly the kind of opportunity I had been working toward. When I told Dominic, expecting we would figure out how to make it work, he looked at me like I had suggested we move to Mars. He couldn't leave, he explained. His music community was here. All his bands and connections and gigs were here. Starting over somewhere else would destroy everything he had built. I pointed out, with years of accumulated frustration, finally breaking through, that he hadn't actually built anything. He was playing the same small venues for the same small audiences he had been playing when we met. The bands kept dissolving and reforming with different names but essentially the same people. He had no recordings, no online presence, no growth trajectory. He was 32 years old and still living like he was 22, convinced that success was just around the corner if he kept doing exactly what he had always been doing. Dominic was wounded by my honesty, saying I had never understood what he was trying to do, that real artists don't measure success by commercial metrics. He accused me of being materialistic and conventional, of trying to force him into a mould that would kill his creativity. And in that argument, I finally heard what he was actually saying. He didn't want to grow or change or build anything sustainable. He wanted to remain in perpetual possibility, always on the verge of something big, without ever having to face the reality of his choices. And more importantly, he wanted a partner who would enable that fantasy indefinitely. I took the promotion and ended the relationship, and the grief was complicated by the realization of how much time I had wasted trying to save someone who didn't actually want to be saved. Dominic wasn't a project or a fixer-upper. He was a grown man who had made consistent choices about the kind of life he wanted, and those choices were fundamentally incompatible with the life I wanted. I had spent 6 years trying to mould him into someone more ambitious and responsible, never stopping to ask if that was even fair, or if I should have just accepted that we wanted different things. The move to the new city was both liberating and disorienting. Without Dominic as my project, I had to confront my own tendency to define myself through caretaking and fixing. I started therapy and discovered that my attraction to people who needed saving was rooted in deep insecurity about my own worthiness. If I could fix someone and make them successful, then I would be valuable and necessary. If I could love someone enough to change them, then I would finally be enough. But that framework was fundamentally flawed because it meant I was only comfortable in relationships where I held all the power and my partner held all the need. I threw myself into my new job and discovered I was actually really good at what I did when I wasn't dividing my energy between work and managing someone else's life. I made friends with colleagues who had healthy relationships with partners who were actual partners, splitting responsibilities and supporting each other's growth. I watched how they navigated disagreements and disappointments without one person always being the caretaker and the other always being the one who needed care. It was a revelation to see that relationships could be balanced, that you could love someone without trying to fix or change them. About a year after the breakup, I started dating someone I met through a professional networking event. Owen was a project manager at a tech company, reliable and ambitious in ways that would have bored me 6 years earlier. But now, after years of chaos and disappointment with Dominic, Owen's consistency felt like a gift rather than a limitation. He showed up when he said he would. He followed through on plans. He had goals and took concrete steps toward them. When he said he would call, he actually called. What struck me most about being with Owen was how easy it felt. Not easy like effortless, but easy like natural. We both worked demanding jobs and supported each other's careers without one person having to sacrifice everything. We had disagreements and worked through them like adults, without dramatics or accusations. Neither of us was trying to fix or change the other. We just liked each other as we actually were, not as we might become with enough support or patience or love. I heard through mutual friends that Dominic was still playing music in the same venues, still talking about the breakthrough that was just around the corner. I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because I genuinely had cared about him and wanted good things for him, even if we weren't right for each other. Relief because I was no longer responsible for managing his disappointments or propping up his unsustainable dreams. The hardest lesson I learned from that relationship was that you can't love someone into being who you need them to be. Dominic was never going to become more responsible or ambitious or growth-oriented, and honestly, he didn't need to. Those weren't character flaws. They were just who he was, someone who valued spontaneity and artistic freedom over stability and conventional success. The problem wasn't that he was broken. The problem was that I kept trying to fix something that didn't need fixing instead of accepting that we simply wanted different lives. 2 years after leaving Dominic, I was genuinely happy in a way I hadn't been during our entire 6-year relationship. My career was thriving, my relationship with Owen was healthy and balanced, and I had finally stopped defining my worth by how much I could sacrifice for someone else. I still loved music and art and creativity, but I had learned that appreciating those things didn't mean I had to build my life around someone else's artistic aspirations. I could support the arts without martyring myself to a partner who expected me to fund and manage their dreams, while they remained unburdened by practical reality. The closure I found didn't come from any final conversation with Dominic, or from him finally acknowledging how much I had done for him. It came from accepting that those 6 years had taught me exactly what I didn't want in a partnership, and that knowledge was worth every dollar an hour I had invested. Some people are meant to be in our lives temporarily, to teach us crucial lessons about our own patterns and needs. Dominic taught me that I didn't need to earn love through caretaking, that my value wasn't determined by how much I could fix or change someone, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is accept that wanting different things doesn't make either person wrong. That story reminds us that you can waste years trying to transform someone into your ideal partner, or you can accept who they actually are and find someone whose reality already matches your vision. Our next story comes from someone who learned that the hardest breakup of their life wasn't with their partner, but with the version of their future they had spent years building in their imagination. I was 34 when my engagement to Simone ended after 4 years together, and what devastated me wasn't losing her specifically, but losing the entire life narrative I had constructed around us. We had met through a dating app during a time when I'd almost given up on finding someone, convinced that my window for the traditional relationship timeline had closed. Simone seemed like everything I had been searching for, someone who wanted marriage and kids and the suburban house with the good school district. She was a high school teacher, loved her family, and talked openly about wanting to build a life with someone. On our third date, we joked about being each other's person, and by month 6 I was already imagining our wedding. Looking back now, with the clarity that only distance provides, I can see that I fell in love with the idea of Simone rather than the reality of who she actually was. I was so desperate to check the boxes I thought I was supposed to check by my mid-30s that I ignored every sign that we weren't actually compatible on a fundamental level. Simone was deeply introverted and needed significant alone time to recharge, while I was energized by social interaction and group activities. She was cautious and risk-averse, carefully planning every decision, while I tended towards spontaneity and following my instincts. She wanted to stay in our hometown near her family forever, while I had always dreamed of travelling and maybe even living abroad for a while. But I convinced myself that these differences were complementary rather than problematic. I told myself that opposites attract, that we balanced each other out, that love meant compromise and adaptation. What I was actually doing was systematically erasing parts of myself to fit into the relationship I thought I was supposed to want. I stopped making plans with friends because Simone preferred quiet evenings at home. I abandoned the idea of travelling because she was anxious about flying and uncomfortable in unfamiliar places. I never brought up my fantasy of taking a sabbatical to teach English in another country because I knew it would conflict with her vision of us buying a house and settling down immediately. The engagement happened in year 3, and it was exactly the kind of proposal I had always imagined. Simone planned it meticulously, incorporating all the romantic elements I had mentioned liking over our years together. We told our families, posted the obligatory ring photo on social media, and immediately launched into wedding planning. My mum was ecstatic, relieved that I was finally settling down. Simone's parents welcomed me warmly into their family, already talking about grandchildren and holiday traditions. Everyone around us radiated happiness about our future, and I pushed down the growing sense of unease that had started gnawing at me. The wedding planning process was when the cracks really started showing. Every decision became a negotiation where I would eventually concede to what Simone wanted because she had stronger opinions and I was conflict averse. She wanted a big traditional wedding with 200 guests, while I would have preferred something smaller and more intimate. She wanted to buy a house in the neighbourhood where she grew up, walking distance from her parents, while I had been hoping we might explore different areas or even different cities. She wanted to start trying for kids immediately after the wedding, while I had been thinking we might wait a year or two to just be married for a while. But I kept telling myself that these were normal compromises, that no couple agreed on everything, that Simone's certainty about what she wanted was actually a good thing because at least one of us had a clear vision. I ignored the fact that her clear vision was steamrolling my much hazier preferences, that I was becoming a supporting character in the story of her life rather than the co-author of our shared life. I ignored the tightness in my chest when I thought about our future, the way I would zone out during conversations about wedding centerpieces and honeymoon destinations to safe nearby resorts. 6 months before the wedding, I started having panic attacks. They would hit me at random moments, sometimes while I was at work, sometimes in the middle of the night. My heart would race, and my chest would constrict and I would feel this overwhelming certainty that something was terribly wrong. I went to my doctor, thinking something was physically wrong with me, and he suggested the attacks might be anxiety-related and asked if there were any major stressors in my life. I mentioned the wedding planning, but framed it as normal stress, not wanting to admit even to myself what my body was trying to tell me. The real confrontation with reality came during a conversation with Simone about our honeymoon. She'd booked a week at an all-inclusive resort in Mexico, the kind of place with scheduled activities and familiar American food, and minimal cultural immersion. When I suggested we might consider something more adventurous, maybe backpacking through some smaller towns or taking a cooking class to learn about the local cuisine, Simone looked at me like I had suggested we go camping in a war zone. She reminded me that she didn't like unpredictability or unfamiliar situations, that a honeymoon was supposed to be relaxing, not stressful. And in that moment, something in me finally broke through the denial I had been maintaining for 4 years. This wasn't about a honeymoon. This was about the fact that I had spent our entire relationship suppressing my own desires and preferences to maintain a relationship with someone who fundamentally wanted different things from life. Simone wasn't wrong for wanting security and familiarity and a life close to her family, but I wasn't wrong for wanting adventure and new experiences and the possibility of building a life that didn't follow the exact script I'd been handed. I called off the wedding 3 months before it was supposed to happen. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, sitting across from Simone in our living room and telling her that I couldn't marry her, not because she had done anything wrong, but because I had finally admitted to myself that we wanted incompatible lives. She was devastated and furious, demanding to know why I had waited so long, why I had proposed if I wasn't sure, how I could do this to her with everything already planned and paid for. I didn't have good answers to those questions because the truth was too complicated and painful. I had proposed because I thought it was what I was supposed to do at my age, with someone who checked all the right boxes. I had ignored my doubts because admitting them would mean confronting my own fears about never finding the right person or running out of time to have the family I thought I wanted. I had let things get this far because breaking up got harder with every milestone we passed, every deposit we made, every person we told about our plans. The aftermath was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just losing Simone, I was losing the entire future I had spent years imagining. The house we would buy, the kids we would have, the family holidays and school plays and all the mundane, beautiful moments I had pictured. I was losing the identity of being someone's fiancé, someone who had figured out their life and was following the approved timeline. I was facing my mid-30s, suddenly single again, while all my friends were married with kids. Back in a dating pool, I thought I had successfully escaped. My mum was disappointed in a way that hurt more than I wanted to admit. She had been so excited about the wedding, already shopping for grandmother-appropriate outfits in anticipation of future grandchildren. Simone's family understandably wanted nothing to do with me. Mutual friends had to choose sides, and most of them sided with Simone because she was the one who had been left, who had done nothing wrong except love someone who couldn't fully love her back. I spent the first few months after the breakup in a fog of grief and guilt and regret. I second-guessed my decision constantly, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake, if I had thrown away something good because I was chasing some fantasy of a more exciting life that didn't actually exist. Maybe Simone had been right, and I was being immature, prioritizing adventure over stability, refusing to grow up and settle down like a responsible adult. Maybe the panic attacks were just normal pre-wedding jitters that everyone experienced, and I had overreacted. But then something shifted during a conversation with my older brother. He had always been the adventurous one in our family, the one who had travelled extensively before settling down, who had lived in 3 different countries before meeting his wife. I confessed my doubts about ending the engagement, and he asked me a question that cut through all my confusion. He asked if I could honestly picture myself at 60, looking back on a life lived according to Simone's preferences, and feeling satisfied that I had made the right choice. The answer was immediate and clear. No, I couldn't picture that version of my life without feeling a deep sense of loss for all the experiences I had never had, all the dreams I had abandoned, all the parts of myself I had suppressed. And that answer, as painful as it was to acknowledge, confirmed that ending the engagement had been the right decision, no matter how hard it was. I started therapy to work through the guilt and grief, and my therapist helped me see that I hadn't been fair to either Simone or myself by staying in a relationship where I was fundamentally pretending to be someone I wasn't. Simone deserved a partner who genuinely wanted the life she envisioned, not someone who was white-knuckling their way through it out of obligation and fear, and I deserved the chance to build a life that actually reflected my values and desires, even if that life looked different from what I had been told it should look like. Slowly, I started rebuilding my life according to my own preferences rather than inherited expectations. I took that sabbatical I had been dreaming about and spent 6 months teaching English in Vietnam. I reconnected with old friends and made new ones who shared my interest in travel and new experiences. I dated casually without the pressure of immediately assessing every person as potential marriage material. I learned that my worth wasn't determined by my relationship status or whether I was following the approved timeline for life milestones. 3 years after calling off the wedding, I heard through a mutual friend that Simone had gotten married to someone she met through her school. I felt genuinely happy for her, hoping she had found someone who shared her vision and wouldn't make her compromise on the things that mattered to her. And I felt grateful that I'd been brave enough to let her go so she could find that person, even though being brave had felt more like being a coward at the time. I eventually met someone who matched my energy and curiosity about the world, someone who saw travel and adventure as essential rather than stressful, someone who wanted to build a life based on experiences rather than checking off traditional milestones. Our relationship developed slowly and organically, without the desperate need to force it into a predetermined shape. When we did eventually get engaged, it felt right in a way my engagement to Simone never had, because this time I was saying yes to the actual person and life in front of me, rather than the idea of what that person and life represented. That story teaches us that sometimes the life you think you're supposed to want is just a story you've been told so many times you mistook it for your own desires, and real happiness requires the courage to write your own narrative. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that sometimes you have to grieve not just the relationship that ended, but the person you became while trying to keep it alive. I was 27 when Isabel and I broke up after 8 years together, and what surprised me most wasn't the pain of losing her, but the relief of finally being able to stop performing. We'd started dating in college, both of us 19 and convinced we had found our forever person in the way only 19-year-olds can be. Isabel was studying environmental science, and I was in pre-med, and we had this shared vision of ourselves as a power couple who would change the world. She would save the planet, and I would save lives, and we would do it all together as partners who balanced ambition with deep love and commitment. The first few years were genuinely wonderful, in the way early relationships often are when you're discovering each other, and everything feels significant. We studied together in the library until closing, made elaborate meals in our tiny shared apartment, and stayed up late talking about the lives we would build together. Isabel was passionate and driven, the kind of person who threw herself completely into whatever she cared about. I admired that intensity, even though it sometimes left me feeling like I was constantly trying to keep up with her energy and conviction. Medical school changed things in ways I didn't recognise at the time. The workload was crushing and all-consuming, leaving little room for anything else. Isabel was supportive at first, understanding when I had to cancel plans or when I was too exhausted to do anything but study. But somewhere around my second year, her support started feeling more like resignation. She would make comments about how I was married to medicine now, how she felt like a medical school widow. When I tried to explain that this was temporary, that residency would be hard too, but eventually things would calm down. She would just nod in a way that suggested she didn't actually believe me. The real issues started when Isabel got a job offer with an environmental non-profit that would require significant travel. She would be gone for weeks at a time, doing field work in remote locations, and she was thrilled about the opportunity. I was happy for her genuinely, but also terrified about what it would mean for us. We were already struggling to find time together with my medical school schedule, and now she would be physically absent for large chunks of time. When I expressed these concerns, Isabel accused me of trying to hold her back, of wanting her to sacrifice her career for mine, the way women have always been expected to do. That argument set a pattern that would define the next 5 years of our relationship. I would express a need or concern, Isabel would interpret it as me trying to control or limit her, and I would backtrack and apologise and assure her that I supported her completely. I learned to never voice doubts or worries, to always be enthusiastically supportive, even when I was lonely and struggling. I became an expert at performing the role of the perfect supportive partner while slowly suffocating under the weight of my own unexpressed needs. Isabel's career took off in ways that were genuinely impressive. She was travelling internationally for research projects, getting published in respected journals, building a reputation in her field. I was proud of her, but I was also desperately lonely. My residency was brutal, 80-hour weeks of overnight shifts and constant stress. I would come home to an empty apartment because Isabel was in the Amazon or Madagascar or Indonesia, and I would eat cereal for dinner alone and try not to think about how this wasn't the partnership I'd imagined we were building. When Isabel was home, things weren't much better. She was always exhausted from travel and focused on preparing for the next trip. Our conversations became logistical updates rather than genuine connection. We would talk about her research and my rotations in this surface level way that never touched on how we were actually feeling or whether we were happy. Sex became infrequent and perfunctory, something we did out of obligation rather than desire. We stopped laughing together, stopped having inside jokes, stopped being curious about each other's inner lives. But we stayed together because we had been together for so long, because everyone saw us as the couple who had made it through college and medical school and career building. Our families loved the narrative of us as soulmates who had found each other young and never wavered. Our friends treated us as relationship role models, proof that it was possible to maintain love while pursuing ambitious careers. Breaking up would mean admitting that the story everyone believed about us wasn't actually true. Year 7 was when I started feeling like I was disappearing. I had become so practiced at suppressing my own needs and putting Isabel's career and happiness first that I barely recognised myself anymore. I was finishing my residency in emergency medicine, which I had chosen partly because it was what my parents wanted, and partly because I thought the irregular shifts would give me flexibility for Isabel's schedule. But I had never stopped to ask myself if emergency medicine was what I actually wanted, if the constant chaos and trauma of the ER was feeding or depleting my soul. My best friend from medical school, Chen, noticed something was wrong during one of our rare coffee meetups. He asked point blank if I was happy, and I opened my mouth to give my practiced response about how everything was fine, but nothing came out. I just sat there silently, and then I started crying in the middle of a crowded Starbucks. Chen didn't say anything, just waited while I cried, and then he asked me the question I had been avoiding for years. When was the last time I had done something for myself, not for Isabel, or for my career, or for anyone else's expectations, but just because I wanted to? I couldn't answer. I genuinely could not think of a single thing I had done recently, purely for my own joy or fulfillment. Everything in my life was in service of maintaining the relationship or advancing the career I had chosen without really examining if it was the right fit. I had become a person who only existed in relation to other people's needs and expectations, with no core self underneath all the performing and accommodating. That conversation with Chen planted a seed that grew into something I couldn't ignore. I started paying attention to my own reactions and feelings instead of immediately suppressing them. I noticed that I felt relieved rather than disappointed when Isabel's trips got extended. I realised I was happier sleeping alone than sharing a bed with someone who felt like a stranger. I acknowledged that when I imagined our future together, the house and the potential kids and the dual career juggling, I felt dread rather than excitement. The breakup conversation happened on a rare evening when we were both home and not completely exhausted. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say, but when I actually started talking, everything came out wrong and jumbled. I told Isabel I couldn't do this anymore, that I felt like I had lost myself somewhere in the process of trying to be the partner she needed. She was shocked and hurt, saying she had no idea I was unhappy, that I had always seemed so supportive and fine with everything. And that was the tragedy of it, really. I had been so determined to be the perfect, supportive partner that I had never let her see the cost of that performance. I had hidden my loneliness and doubt and growing resentment behind a mask of cheerful accommodation. Isabel had no idea she was in a relationship with someone who was slowly disappearing because I had never given her the chance to see the truth. I had lied through omission for years, and now we were both paying the price. The actual separation was surprisingly undramatic. We divided our belongings, figured out the lease situation, and went our separate ways with a kind of exhausted sadness. There was no dramatic fight or betrayal, just the quiet acknowledgement that we had become strangers, pretending to be soulmates. Isabel moved across the country for a new position with an international conservation organisation. I stayed in the city where I had done my residency, suddenly alone in a one-bedroom apartment with no idea who I actually was, underneath all the roles I had been playing. The first 6 months after the breakup were disorienting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without Isabel to organise my life around, I had to confront all the questions I had been avoiding. Did I actually like emergency medicine, or had I just chosen it for practical reasons? What did I enjoy doing when I wasn't trying to accommodate someone else's schedule? What kind of life did I want to build when I wasn't trying to fit into someone else's vision? I started therapy and spent months unpacking how I had learned to make myself small and accommodating in relationships, tracing it back to being the peacekeeper in a chaotic family and learning that my value came from making other people's lives easier. I realised that my relationship with Isabel hadn't been uniquely dysfunctional. I had been primed to disappear into partnerships because I didn't have a strong sense of self to begin with. Slowly, painfully, I started building a life that actually reflected my preferences and values. I switched from emergency medicine to primary care because I realised I was drawn to long-term patient relationships rather than acute crisis management. I started rock climbing because I liked it, not because a partner wanted me to or because it fit into someone else's schedule. I made new friends based on genuine connection rather than convenience or mutual connections to Isabel. About a year after the breakup, I went on a solo camping trip to a national park I had always wanted to visit. Isabel had never been interested in camping, finding it uncomfortable and boring, and I had accepted that without questioning whether I might enjoy it. Sitting by myself next to a campfire, surrounded by mountains and stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the absence of conflict, but genuine contentment with my own company and choices. 2 years after the breakup, I heard through mutual friends that Isabel was engaged to someone she had met through work, another environmental scientist who travelled as much as she did. I felt genuinely happy for her, hoping she had found someone whose life naturally aligned with hers rather than someone who had to constantly contort themselves to fit. And I felt grateful that we'd both been brave enough to admit that love wasn't enough when the fundamental lives we wanted were incompatible. That story shows us that the most important relationship you'll ever have is with yourself. And sometimes you have to end a partnership to remember who you were before you learned to make yourself disappear. Our next story comes from someone who learned that sometimes the person you need to break up with isn't your partner, but the idealized version of them you created to avoid facing the truth. I was 31 when Cameron and I finally ended our 6-year relationship, and the most shocking part wasn't the breakup itself, but realizing how long I had been in love with someone who existed primarily in my imagination. We met at a friend's birthday party, where Cameron was the charismatic center of attention, telling stories that had everyone laughing and making even mundane anecdotes sound fascinating. I was immediately drawn to that energy, to someone who seemed so comfortable in their own skin, while I had spent my entire life second-guessing every word out of my mouth. Our first few months together felt like I had won some kind of lottery. Cameron was attentive and romantic in grand gesture ways that made me feel like I was living in a movie. There were surprise weekend trips and elaborate dates and constant declarations about how I was different from anyone they had ever been with. I interpreted all of this as proof that we had something special, that Cameron's intensity meant they were fully invested in building something real with me. What I didn't see, or chose not to see, was that the grand gestures were easier for Cameron than the quiet, everyday intimacy that actually sustains relationships. The first real crack appeared around month 7 when Cameron lost their job in marketing due to company layoffs. It was legitimately not their fault, but their reaction to it was troubling in ways I initially explained away. Instead of immediately looking for new positions or reaching out to their network, Cameron spent weeks sleeping until afternoon and playing video games. When I gently suggested they might want to start job hunting, they got defensive and accused me of not understanding how devastating the layoff had been, how they needed time to process and recover before jumping back into the corporate grind. I backed off and told myself I was being supportive, that everyone handles setbacks differently. I picked up extra freelance work to cover more of our shared expenses, assuring Cameron that it was fine, and we were a team. The job search stretched from weeks into months, and the pattern became familiar. Cameron would get excited about an opportunity, talk extensively about how perfect it would be, maybe submit an application, and then lose interest when the process required follow-through. There was always a reason why each opportunity wasn't quite right, why the company culture seemed toxic, or the commute was too long, or the salary was insulting. Meanwhile, I was working myself into exhaustion covering expenses for both of us, while also managing all the household tasks that Cameron was suddenly too depressed to handle. I would come home tired from a full day of work to find Cameron on the couch, where I'd left them that morning, surrounded by snack wrappers and empty energy drink cans. When I suggested that maybe they could at least handle some housework while job searching, Cameron would remind me that unemployment was already devastating their self-esteem, and I was making them feel worse. This became the core dynamic of our relationship. Cameron would create a crisis through their own inaction or impulsivity. I would work overtime to manage the consequences, and Cameron would frame themselves as the victim of circumstances beyond their control. When they finally did get a new job after 8 months of unemployment, I was so relieved that I ignored how they had spent those months. I told myself it was just a difficult period we had gotten through together, proof that our relationship could weather hard times. But the pattern repeated with different variables. Cameron would impulsively quit jobs because they didn't like a new manager or found the work boring, always without having another position lined up. They would make expensive purchases we couldn't afford, and then get angry when I expressed concern about our finances. They would plan elaborate trips or experiences they wanted us to have together, and then leave me to figure out the actual logistics and costs while they enjoyed the fantasy of the idea. What I was doing, though I couldn't see it at the time, was creating an alternate version of Cameron in my mind. The Cameron I was in love with was the person from those early months, the one who had seemed so confident and romantic and full of potential. I kept waiting for that person to re-emerge once circumstances improved, once they found the right job, or we moved to a better apartment, or whatever external factor I had decided was preventing them from being their best self. I was in a relationship with a fantasy, while the real Cameron coasted through life, leaving me to manage all the difficult, practical realities. My friends tried to point this out in increasingly direct ways. My sister asked point blank why I was still with someone who treated me like a combination ATM and personal assistant. My best friend Marcus stopped pretending to like Cameron, telling me that watching me exhaust myself for someone who gave nothing back was painful to witness. I got defensive every time, insisting they didn't understand Cameron the way I did, that they only saw the struggles and not the good parts that made it all worthwhile. The truth was that the good parts had become fewer and farther between. The grand romantic gestures had stopped once Cameron knew they had me. The charisma that had initially attracted me was deployed everywhere, except in our relationship. Cameron could be charming and engaging with strangers or at parties, but at home they were checked out and irritable, always scrolling their phone or complaining about being bored. The person I had fallen for had never actually existed beyond that initial courtship phase. I had spent years trying to resurrect someone who had only been a performance. Year 5 brought what should have been an obvious breaking point. I was offered a job opportunity in another city that would be a significant step up in my career. When I told Cameron expecting we would discuss it and make a decision together, they immediately said no. They couldn't move because their band was finally starting to get some traction locally. This was news to me because Cameron's band had broken up 2 months earlier after their bassist quit, and Cameron had never mentioned forming a new one. When I pointed this out, they got angry and said I was always undermining their creative ambitions, that I didn't support their dreams because I was too focused on conventional career success. I turned down the job opportunity. I told my boss and my family that it wasn't the right time, that Cameron and I had decided together that staying made more sense for both our careers. The truth was that Cameron had decided, and I had once again accommodated their preference while packaging it as our mutual choice. I felt the resentment building, but pushed it down, telling myself that compromise was part of partnership, that my turn would come eventually. The final breaking point came in year 6 during a fight about something completely mundane. Cameron had promised to handle renewing our car registration, a simple task that required filling out a form and paying a fee. Weeks passed and they kept saying they would get to it. When I finally handled it myself, frustrated by having to add one more thing to my mental load, Cameron got defensive and said I was always nagging them and treating them like a child. Something in me snapped. I really heard myself, apologising for asking my partner to handle one basic adult responsibility. I heard the excuses and deflections I had been accepting for 6 years, the way Cameron had trained me to expect nothing and be grateful for the bare minimum. And I realised with devastating clarity that I had been enabling this entire dynamic, that I had been so desperate to believe in the potential of our relationship that I had ignored the reality staring me in the face. I told Cameron I was done, not in a moment of anger that might blow over, but with a finality that came from years of accumulated disappointment. Cameron was shocked, listing all the reasons we were good together, reminding me of the good times and the plans we had made. But all I could hear was the fantasy version of our relationship, the one that existed in conversation and imagination, but never in actual day-to-day reality. The breakup was messy because Cameron alternated between promising to change and blaming me for giving up on us. They said if I really loved them, I would be more patient, that I was abandoning them when they needed me most. For a few weeks I almost wavered, almost convinced myself that maybe I was being too harsh, that relationships required weathering difficult periods together. But my therapist, who I had started seeing months earlier for what I thought was work stress, helped me see that I had been weathering difficult periods alone for years, while Cameron coasted on my emotional and financial labour. Moving out was liberating in ways I hadn't expected. Living alone, in a small apartment that was just mine, I realised how much space and energy I had been devoting to managing Cameron's moods and crises. I started saying yes to social invitations I would have declined because Cameron found my friends boring. I took a weekend trip by myself and didn't have to coordinate or accommodate anyone else's preferences. I went to bed without having to navigate whether Cameron was in a mood that would require hours of emotional processing before I could finally sleep. The first few months after the breakup, I kept waiting for the grief to hit, for the devastating heartbreak I thought I should be feeling after 6 years together. But mostly, what I felt was relief and a growing sense of anger at myself for staying so long. I was angry that I had wasted my late 20s and early 30s on someone who had never actually shown up as a full partner. I was angry that I had turned down career opportunities and adventures to accommodate someone who would never have made similar sacrifices for me. Therapy helped me understand that I had been attracted to Cameron's initial intensity because it made me feel chosen and special in a way I had always craved. I had been raised by parents who gave love conditionally, based on achievement and meeting their expectations, and Cameron's early overwhelming attention had felt like the unconditional acceptance I had always wanted. What I hadn't seen was that the intensity wasn't sustainable or meaningful. Once the performance phase ended, there was nothing underneath except someone who wanted the benefits of a relationship without any of the actual work. About a year after the breakup, I ran into a mutual friend who updated me on Cameron's life. They had moved back in with their parents, were between jobs again, and had started dating someone new. The friend said it seemed like the same pattern, that Cameron's new partner was young and clearly smitten and probably heading for the same disillusionment I had experienced. I felt a flicker of concern for this stranger, but mostly just gratitude that it wasn't my problem anymore. 2 years after ending things with Cameron, my life looked completely different. I had taken a job in a new city, something I had wanted to do but kept putting off. I was dating someone who showed up consistently, who handled their responsibilities without me having to manage them, who was interested in building something together rather than having me build around them. The difference was stark enough that I sometimes felt embarrassed about how long I had accepted scraps and called it love. The real closure came not from any interaction with Cameron, but from finally grieving the fantasy relationship I had been clinging to. I had to mourn the potential I had seen in those early months, the partnership I thought we were building, the version of Cameron I had loved that had never actually existed beyond my imagination. That grief was different from missing the actual person. It was mourning my own lost time and misplaced faith, accepting that I had been complicit in my own disappointment by refusing to see reality. That story reminds us that sometimes staying in the wrong relationship isn't about love at all, but about being more committed to who you want someone to be than accepting who they actually are. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the relationship they thought had destroyed them actually became the foundation for the strongest version of themselves they had ever been. I was 28 when Nadia left me, and I genuinely believed my life was over in that dramatic, all-consuming way that feels embarrassingly naive in retrospect. We had been together for 3 years, living together for 2 of them, and I had built my entire sense of self around being her partner. When she sat me down one evening and told me she'd been unhappy for months and needed to end things, I felt like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The breakup itself was almost clinical in its efficiency. Nadia had clearly been planning it for a while, had already looked at apartments and figured out the logistics of separating our shared life. She was calm and clear as she explained that she had grown in different directions than me, that she needed space to figure out who she was outside of our relationship, that she still cared about me but wasn't in love with me anymore. I sat there stunned, unable to process that someone could fall out of love so completely while I was still completely immersed in loving them. She moved out within a week, taking half the furniture and leaving behind her apartment that felt cavernous and empty in ways that had nothing to do with missing furniture. The first month after Nadia left was the darkest period of my adult life. I called in sick to work for days at a time, unable to face the performative normalcy of showing up and pretending everything was fine. I stopped eating properly, living on delivery food and whatever required zero effort. I scrolled through our old photos obsessively, looking for signs I had missed that she was unhappy, replaying conversations and moments to figure out where exactly things had gone wrong. I texted her long, rambling messages at 2 a.m, begging her to reconsider, promising I would change whatever needed changing if she would just give us another chance. Nadia was kind but firm in her responses, reiterating that her decision was final and that maintaining contact was making it harder for both of us to move forward. Eventually, she stopped responding altogether, and that silence was somehow worse than rejection. At least when she was telling me no, I was still connected to her in some way. The complete absence of her from my life felt unbearable. My best friend Keisha finally staged what she called an intervention, but what felt more like an ambush. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, took one look at the state of the place and the state of me, and told me I had 48 hours to either pull myself together or she was calling my parents to come get me. She wasn't cruel about it, just direct in a way that cut through the fog of my depression. She told me that I could either let this breakup destroy me or I could use it as an opportunity to figure out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple. That conversation didn't immediately fix anything, but it planted a seed that started growing despite my resistance. I forced myself back to work, where the routine and structure gave me something to focus on, besides my misery. I started going to the gym at Keisha's insistence, and while I hated every minute of it initially, I eventually found that the physical exhaustion helped quiet the constant loop of thoughts about Nadia and what I could have done differently. I started seeing a therapist who specialised in relationship issues and life transitions, mostly because Keisha wouldn't stop nagging me about it. Therapy was where I started to uncover uncomfortable truths about my relationship with Nadia and about myself. My therapist asked me to describe my daily life before the breakup, and I realised with growing discomfort that I couldn't really separate my routines from Nadia's preferences. I had stopped hanging out with certain friends because she found them draining. I had abandoned hobbies I used to love because she wasn't interested in them, and I wanted to spend all my time doing things we could do together. I had made my world smaller and smaller until it revolved entirely around her, and then I was shocked when she said I had become too dependent. The therapist helped me see a pattern that extended beyond just my relationship with Nadia. I had a tendency to lose myself in relationships, to merge so completely with whoever I was dating that I stopped existing as a separate person. It came from a deep insecurity about my own worthiness, a belief that I needed to be everything to someone else to justify taking up space in their life. With Nadia, I had been so afraid of losing her that I had systematically erased the parts of myself that didn't fit into what I thought she wanted, never realising that in the process I had become less interesting and less whole. About 3 months after the breakup, something shifted. I woke up one morning and realised I had gone an entire day without thinking about Nadia, without checking her social media or wondering what she was doing. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. I started testing the boundaries of my independence in small ways. I went to a concert alone for a band I loved, but Nadia had hated. I signed up for a pottery class I had been interested in years ago, but never pursued. I started saying yes to social invitations, even when I didn't particularly feel like being social, forcing myself to engage with the world instead of hiding in my apartment. Reconnecting with old friends was both wonderful and painful. They were uniformly happy to see me, but also honest about the fact that I had become a bit of a ghost during my relationship with Nadia. One friend told me gently that he had stopped inviting me to things because I always either declined or spent the entire time checking my phone and worrying about when Nadia wanted me home. Another friend admitted she had been relieved when we broke up because she thought maybe I would finally start acting like myself again instead of like Nadia's shadow. These conversations stung, but they also validated what I was starting to understand about how I had been living. I had been so consumed with being the perfect partner that I had stopped being a complete person. And the tragedy was that my attempts to be perfect had actually made me less attractive to Nadia. She hadn't fallen in love with someone who had no opinions or interests of their own. She had fallen in love with the person I was before I started performing perfection for her, and then I had slowly disappeared that person in an attempt to keep her. 6 months after the breakup, I started dating again, tentatively and with a lot of anxiety. But this time, I approached it differently. Instead of immediately trying to mould myself to match whoever I was seeing, I practiced maintaining boundaries and being honest about my preferences and needs. It felt awkward and unnatural at first, like I was being selfish or difficult. But I was amazed by how many people responded positively to me actually having a personality instead of just reflecting theirs back at them. I went on dates with people who were lovely but wrong for me, and instead of trying to force compatibility, I simply acknowledged that and moved on. I practiced saying things like, "I'm not really into that," or "I'd prefer to do something else," without immediately backtracking to accommodate someone else's wishes. I learned that having preferences and boundaries didn't make me difficult or unlovable. It made me an actual person that someone could choose to be with, or not based on genuine compatibility, rather than my willingness to be whatever they needed. About a year after the breakup, I ran into Nadia at a coffee shop in our old neighbourhood. My stomach dropped when I saw her, and all the old feelings came rushing back for a moment. But as we made awkward small talk, I realised something had fundamentally changed. She looked the same, sounded the same, but I felt different. I wasn't trying to read her expressions for signs of lingering feelings or opportunities to win her back. I was just having a polite conversation with someone I used to know, someone who had once been central to my world, but was now just a person with their own life that had nothing to do with mine. She asked how I was doing with genuine interest, and I told her honestly that I was good. She seemed relieved, maybe had been carrying some guilt about how the breakup had affected me. As we said goodbye and went our separate ways, I felt this profound sense of gratitude. Not gratitude that she had left me exactly, but gratitude for what her leaving had forced me to confront and rebuild. 2 years after the breakup, my life was unrecognisable from where I had been in those dark early months. I had been promoted at work after finally applying myself instead of just coasting. I had a solid group of friends who actually knew me as a full person rather than as someone's boyfriend. I had hobbies and interests that were genuinely mine, not adopted to please a partner. And when I did eventually meet someone I wanted to be in a relationship with, I was able to show up as a complete person rather than a blank canvas waiting to be painted by their preferences. The relationship with Nadia ending had felt like death at the time, like I was losing not just her but my entire identity and future. But what actually died was a version of myself that had been fundamentally unhealthy, the version that needed to disappear into relationships to feel valuable. What got built in its place was someone capable of genuine partnership, because I finally understood that you can't truly choose to be with someone if you don't know who you are when you're alone. That story teaches us that sometimes the relationship that breaks your heart is actually the one that saves your life, by forcing you to finally build a foundation strong enough to stand on your own. And that's where we'll pause for the night, everyone. These tales of heartbreak and healing always leave me feeling like sometimes the relationships that end are actually the ones that set us free to become who we're meant to be. Maybe every ending is also a beginning, Or maybe we're all just one honest conversation away from understanding ourselves a little better. If you enjoyed this collection of breakup stories as much as I did, please consider subscribing and joining me again for another night of reflection and satisfying tales. Thanks for listening, and until next time, sweet dreams.